historically, it takes national investment to pursue these really large-scale, expensive spaceflight programs, especially human spaceflight, which is extraordinarily expensive and risky, and that has been motivated by generally questions of political incentive, prestige, international prestige, or domestic pride is another one of those factors, and so.
Yeah.
Or national security is a major factor, but if these types of programs don't necessarily contribute and feed into those areas, the question is, will they still be funded? And I think that as we increase partnership between the National Space Program and private industry, that things might shift a bit. So it is important to recognize that that the private space industry has been essential to the American space program from the very start, and that with the Apollo program, 94% of people working on that program were in industry, either contractors or subcontractors, and NASA employees were actually a very small percentage of the workforce. It was hundreds of thousands of people, and it was industry spread across the United States that contributed to it, although the model has really changed over time. And in terms of intellectual property and sort of this relationship from NASA having a lot of sort of control and management of the programs and the different elements, and the contractors really being responsible for individual components more than entire systems.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a simplified version of it, but that's more or less some of the shift. Today, it's more like we're purchasing a seat on a SpaceX spacecraft, much more in line like what the United States does with Russia and on Soyuz, is that we purchase a seat. So it's interesting to see that relationship is very similar between, at least in many ways, between the U.S. and Russia in terms of how to send astronauts to the International Space Station in the U.S. and SpaceX. And I don't really have an answer for how then that contributes to the relationship between space and national identity. I think it's shifting right now, and I'm curious to see what happens with it. But I will say for the call to return to the moon, the new Artemis program, the ways that I've seen it, seems quite different than Apollo. There are a number of elements, but one of them is it seems much more focused at a domestic audience, and it seems more about the ways Americans think about themselves or national pride as opposed to international prestige. And that seems to be where the emphasis lies. In the 1960s, Apollo was not very popular domestically, but that wasn't really the point of the program. It was an international program, so it was important that it was popular internationally. And I think today we see something a bit different, where that we have a much greater domestic focus.
Yeah, interesting. Huh. And I suppose that it's interesting to watch the privatization of space occur, at least perception-wise, because that also poses an interesting problem for sort of the diplomacy aspects of space, like we discussed earlier. I envision that space, even when relationships between countries have gotten bad on the face, space has always represented that track to diplomacy, which sort of is a non-political way of interacting between countries, like between China and Russia, as well as our relationships with those countries have sort of waxed and waned over time. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it is changing sort of under our feet, and it'll be interesting to watch to see what happens and how the new relationships with private industry then affect something like diplomacy. I was recently asked a question by a journalist in Argentina about SpaceX, and they brought this Dragon on board the spacecraft with them, and the price for that toy, went up, and the question of, and they were asking about capitalism and how that reflected that, and I also thought about that mission, and the astronauts drove out to the launch pad in the Tesla, and so traditionally it would be the Astrovan, and there wouldn't be that same sort of branding incentive, and so that's one of the things that has really changed, and I think it'll have long-term consequences on NASA and the American space program. And what exactly those are is still, I think, up for question. But that is a major shift from something that would have traditionally been more focused on NASA and the U.S. space program to private industry. So we'll see.